thank you very much for being here, Lawrence and Nethery. We at Wimblu, we believe that stories have the ability to bring us together around a collective imagination and create a refuge where we can connect with other people and the world. This is why at Wimblu we have set out to create spaces of community around our stories, to come together to navigate these uncertain times, connect with different perspectives, and imagine other possible worlds. The Meet the Authors encounters are part of our efforts to connect the persons behind our stories and create a community of storytellers addressing the intersections of ecology and spirituality. These conversations allow us to delve deeper into the themes that each story explores, the creative processes involved, and the worldviews from which they emerge. So welcome to the Meet the Authors event, Language in Bodies with Nethery Wylie and Lawrence English, both authors of our latest volume, Volume 9, under the theme Language of Wimblu Magazine. Nethery Wylie is an artist from the United States who centers her creative practice on the plant world. Raised by a forester, Nethery has studied botany and history. She looks for links between garden, kitchen, and landscape in her art practice. In current projects, she is focused on meeting local trees as she walks in their neighborhoods. She lives in Colorado Springs. She is the author of Transliteration, a text where she tries to draw a tree. Nethery entertains the idea of plant bodies as signs, recognizing in the process how corporeal language is and how coming back to our own bodies may help us recognize the languages of others. Our second guest is Lawrence English, an artist, composer, and curator based in Australia. Working across an array of aesthetic investigations, English work explores the politics of perception and prompts questions of feel, agency, and memory. English utilizes a variety of approaches, including visceral live performance and site-specific installation, to create work that invites audiences to consider their relationship to listening, place, and embodiment. He's the author of Oseni, a sound piece where Lawrence offers us a space to listen to the voice of the Pacific Ocean. As we let ourselves be touched by the movement of sounds of this audio, we begin to sense the many languages in which this ocean expresses its vitality. So, to start, I want to say that these two stories are part of a chapter of the Volume 9 in which we wanted to explore and give a space to stories that will motivate us to imagine other languages and other forms of non-human language that would allow us to somehow put ourselves in the skin of the other. This non-human skin in Transliteration is placed in the skin of trees and plants, and on the other hand, in Oseni, it is placed in the skin of the Pacific Ocean. So both stories entertain the idea of bodies as form of language. This invites us to imagine that as beings with bodies, we can also be part of the great conversation, one that may be devoid of words, but where voices from the more than human world participate as well. A conversation that involves letting go of many preconceived ideas we have humans about language. In your experience, I want to start with this question. In your experiences, where did you find inspiration or knowledge to incorporate these kinds of corporeal languages into your work? Maybe Nethery, we can start with you.
Well, I think we humans have been talking for a very long time now, like 100,000 years or more. And we're getting louder, but we're getting more confused, I would say. And like most people, my tools for understanding things are really designed around the received tools that I have are really designed around language and words and the way humans communicate. But then if you step away from that, like sit under a tree for an hour, the world does seem bigger, more open, more possibilities. It shifts that space opens that space. And so for a long time, I wanted to pull together my practice in art and then the background I have in botany and interest in plants. But I found it very difficult. Uh, um, I was frustrated because a lot of the work I made was too much like a science diagram or constrained by all the norms of landscape painting or botanical illustration. And it felt very over-determined by human needs. So I really struggled for a long time to find some kind of access to another way of approaching it. I had a lot of help from books I read, and there's a lot of new writing on uh, the vegetal world and our relationship to it, a lot of it in philosophy, and I'm not trained in that way at all. And I also stumbled into a lovely class taught by Alessandra and Maya Khan. And it really they kind of held my hand through that frustration, and I came out the other side. So,
Thank you. What about you, Lauren? Lawrence?
I mean, look, I think you raise a really interesting question here, which is, when we think about language, I mean, there are there's a multiplicity of layers that sort of exist there. One of them is about developing, common ground, if you like, that we can share, whether that be like a language cluster, like like, Spanish or English or whatever the case might be. But I think the other side of it that sometimes we tend not to spend quite as much time thinking about is the sort of reception of those things. So, and I mean, I think that for me is probably where I tie to this conversation around language is potentially around the sort of listenership that travels with something like that. And I think Nethery's work, for example, is a really good example. It's a way of thinking about your relationship to these things that a lot of people would assume are not necessarily communicating. I mean, obviously, we know there is a wide variety of communication, whether it be in terms of plants, obviously, like there's a lot of communication through root systems, there's communication through sound, and we're starting to understand how things like plant vision work now. So there's a kind of different sensory capacity to objects that we thought don't share any of the kinds of engagements with the world that we might. So in some respects, that kind of research and awareness and growing capacity to appreciate these things is part of that conversation around language, I feel anyway, um, in that it's asking us to uh, recognize our role as a participant in that dialogue, that isn't just us putting forward our particular way of approaching language and communication, but trying to find ourselves available or make ourselves available to these other kinds of situations that might require us not to speak, but to listen.
Both answers make me feel or think about the role of the body. You talk about reception. Nethery was talking about tools. At the end of the day, our body is the most efficient tool in order to be the receptor of all this communication that is happening all around us. And this has to do with the contemplation, the listening, and the ability to silence all those discursive or rational mind thoughts that we have all the time that is actually taking control of our lives most of the time. It's really hard to actually find that silence. So I'm curious about what is what is the role of contemplation and listening or in your creative processes? What is how did that inform both of stories? It could be Nethery first. Yeah.
Well, the listening and contemplation in terms of what I did for this um, comes first. It has to come first. Um, and it's not easy for me. I have a very busy mind. Um, uh, but you have to make some space. And the way I found it, a helpful way for me to think about it was to turn off what I call the predator eye, um, the eye that is looking for advantage, the eye that is comparing whatever it's comparing, speeds of prey or shapes of trees or whatever, that mind that is constantly working to uh, take advantage like a predator. And once I could do that, then the drawing process itself, the doing of it, and then the reflection of what I was doing through the sitting there started to be not based on those calculations, the calculating mind, but more on the body and the body without all those rational processes that distract you from what you're actually doing physically in space.
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting question, I think, and that idea of I tend to agree that idea of contemplation and listenership. I think that that can come first. And for me, I think the connection maybe there is a connection between contemplation and research because I think for me they're two of the kind of travel in parallel together. You're trying to fill up your mind, not so much in a, like you say, that kind of like predatory way, but in a way that's really open and porous, and that there's that kind of like capacity to um, reflect on the scope or the frame, if you like, of the idea that you're trying to kind of work with. And I mean, I've actually spent a lot of time just in terms of the Oseni piece, thinking about the Pacific and also in some respects thinking about the body because it's interesting. The body, I think, is a really, I mean, obviously an incredibly, it's our great resource, that we can use to reach out into the world. But at the same time, there are physical limitations around that. So if we're thinking about listening, I mean, there is a physiological limitation to our capacity as auditory beings, which is, for most of us, probably not most of us here on this call, but there's 20 hertz at a very low frequency sound, up to 20 kilohertz, which is a high frequency sound, which I'm pretty sure none of us can hear anymore. But in our youthful, vigorous forms, we would have had that amazing high frequency fizz that we could appreciate. Now we have a more mature hearing, I like to say, that sort of maybe cuts off around 16 and a half kilohertz. But thinking about that limitation is interesting because I guess in some respects, we know from various kinds of situations, whether that be, research or, through the use of translation devices and technologies that allow us to reach, if you like, either side of that, and even into other kinds of spectra, like the electromagnetic spectrum, which right now each of us is sitting in a room where there's a very strong electromagnetic resonance that is effectively inaudible to us, but it is present there. And if we use certain kinds of devices, we can make those inaudible sounds audible, and we can start to appreciate the sort of excess, if you like, of the kind of materials that we produce as a species. And for each of us now, there's either a very strong 50 cycle power hum or 60 cycle power hum that is basically dominating, if you like, the kind of inaudible background of our environments right now. So I think this idea of translation devices is really important because maybe that's our way of recognizing the scope of our capacity as sensory beings. And in recognizing those shortcomings, what it does is it allows us, and at least this is how I feel as someone working a lot with sound, is that it allows us this opportunity to really contemplate those things that are in excess of our appreciable sense. And it's almost like the knowledge or the not knowing what is there that kind of drives us towards being curious, being available, being sort of hungry, and in some respects having to contemplate these questions that ideally they kind of travel with us across our lives because as we as we deepen ourselves through research and through practice, we also recognize the limitations of those things. So it's this constant kind of buffering process where I mean, ideally, we're never satisfied, that we're always curious and that we're always reaching out or being as porous as we can be to the kinds of opportunities to present themselves. Often, I find in very unexpected ways, in the process, and that for me is actually quite one of the great pleasures, I think, of making work, particularly with sound, because you have zero control. You know, you cannot control the environment. You can barely control the technology. And you have so many variables that means that as a listener, I'm choosing a listening from the many thousands of listenings that could take place at any one moment, and I'm having to navigate myself constantly, which is both fatiguing but incredibly satisfying. You know that you're that active and agentive in those moments. And ideally, what happens in a piece like Oseni is that I'm in some way able to represent, what I call the listener's listening. You know, the sort of preoccupations and interests that I maintain as, creatively in this case, can be shared with someone else. There is a fantastic French author, Peter Shendy, who I quote quite often, and he has these two wonderful provocations that were very influential and still are very influential for me. And the first one is, can one make a listening listen to? And I think what's really important about that provocation is that it's saying a listening, not listening, like not this kind of absolute thing, but a listening, that kind of pathway that I'm talking about. And if you can you transmit that listening as unique as it is? And for me, that's where the translation devices and the technology come into it, if you like, the kind of prosthetic ear of the microphone. And you're trying to kind of marry up these two things, which are your interior psychological listening that you maintain and this kind of opportunity to transmit that, which is through this audition device, the microphone as a kind of membrane that can allow there to be some sharing of this experience. So I think it's a really curious balancing act always with these things. And I think that's also what maybe helps you maintain that curiosity. At least I certainly find that helps me maintain my curiosity.
So it's really interesting because in one hand, this idea of the calculating mind and the contemplation as an act of wanting something with to kind of listen to something but not completely understand it. Like this is like let go of this rational result minded approach that we usually have when we set out to do a drawing or a creative piece. So the idea of the contemplation as a way also to silence that voice and to let go all these ideas of taking advantage of or getting a result from is really interesting because it like Nethery was saying, opens up another layer into the whatever you're doing, if it's a drawing, right? But also in your relation with that you are contemplating. And on the other hand, Lawrence is mentioning something that is really interesting, that is like a knowledge source as well, but in a way that is pointing towards that we don't know, and it kind of make peace with the fact that we don't know everything, and we won't be able to know everything or listen in this case to everything because our bodies are limited, and the technology is allowing us to have a wider range of sounds, but at the same time, as you were saying, it kind of points towards this idea of humbleness that we need in this time of the human-centric culture that we live in. We measure and do everything or determine everything from our perspective, and that includes our senses. And there's a lot of things that we cannot see. There's a lot of things we cannot hear, and so it's really interesting that to bring those two things and how contemplation is part of your creative processes. And probably you already mentioned a little bit, Lawrence, about this, but I want to delve more into that. Both of you are using really specific mediums. Lawrence is working mainly with sound recording and Nethery. You are working with drawings. Can you tell us a little bit how your craft informs your story? In other words, what is the relationship between the mediums you are exploring and the ideas conveyed in your stories?
Well, drawing or painting, by definition, slows you down. You have to take time to see. It definitely bypasses the editor, and I mean, sometimes it doesn't, and then you get stuck. But it tends to bypass the editor, an analyst. And sometimes I find, and I'm sure, and many artists have said this to me, visual artists, that after they've been in the studio for a few hours, it's really hard to talk. You just simply lose that. Your brain is in a different place. You're just your body has shifted into a different mode. For this though, this I really had to shift also away from thinking about the product, because that I mean, the final drawing, the craft of it, the delivery, the deliverable, and try not to make that the point, because that wasn't the point. It was the space created by the act of doing it. That was the point. So.
Yeah, Nethery, I just got a little question for you on that idea of time. So when you're working on these pieces, are they things that you like when you start that process, are you kind of driven towards um like do you have a timeline that you want to achieve something in? Like, do you feel more satisfied if you can resolve that thing in a day or a week, or is there like a time that feels satisfying in terms of like being able to reconcile what you want to gather on the page?
Um, Not sure how to, I don't have a very easy relationship with time. I have
Mm.
a very fraught relationship with time. Um, yeah, I'm not late to things on purpose. I just am like assume they're just a different time. But in terms of deadlines and there's always I think there's a tension. You need a little bit of tension. At least I need a little bit of tension to not go too wide, but to focus and go forward with a particular project with the idea that it is important to share it. It is important to disseminate. It is important to have something that makes sense to communicate with. But in general, I don't worry about that. But then my work is not as time centered as sound. Um,
Mm.
it I think it exists in a different space. I mean, wasn't it Sartre who talked about that the space of time that you're listening to a melodic phrase has a very different feel. I can't remember. That was like 35 years ago. I read that. Yeah,
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the way that people make work, I have to say generally.
Mhm.
And it is interesting because I think certain mediums obviously encourage, like if you're working with oils, then obviously there's a chemical process that needs to to be respected if you're going to make the work be something that is, legible. And I think that I always find that interesting how the materials that we work with or the mediums that we choose to kind of navigate, they do, by their very nature, they kind of have their own agency that we have to pay attention to. And it's interesting for sound, obviously, we only understand sound in time. So like, as I speak the sentence, it makes sense. If you were just to extract a little section out of it, it doesn't necessarily hold the same sense as it does when it accumulates in time. I mean, the irony being that, as I've spoken the sentence, we're not with that sound anymore. It's now just this kind of thing that we're exhuming from, shallow grave of memory. Um, but for something like this piece that we're talking about today, I mean, it sort of exists in two timelines. Like one of them is the sort of lived experience of these places. So, I mean, it's collected from a whole range of different countries and environments, all in the Pacific. New Zealand and Japan and Australia and North America. And it's interesting because obviously in certain parts when I listen to it, I can hear the individual place. Like there's a part of it was recorded in Okinawa, and uh, I visited Okinawa probably about nearly 15 years ago now because I was obsessed with suzumushi, which are like a very small insect that make a very particular sound, and I was really obsessed with suzumushi. Beautiful, they sound like a bell, and the recording. I traveled the whole island. I was too early in the season. Traveled the whole island and heard two of them. And it was about 5 p.m. And I was quite deflated by this point because we'd literally been driving all day trying to find the mission. And then we stopped at the beach and I was just recording the water because there's a certain kind of coral beach they have in Okinawa. It's very particular. As the tidal waves move back and forth, you get this really kind of metallic shimmer from the way that the materials move in the water. It's actually a really beautiful sound. I mean, Okinawa is an incredible place. Um, and as I was there recording it in the background, this Suzumushi started up, and I was like, wow, I could go and try and capture these Suzumushi. We were right next to a highway, so it wasn't really possible to capture them. But or I could just sit here and let the water be, and this is what I'm here for. And that's really what the recording was. It was this kind of giving over to the what presented itself in front of me, that I had come to be interested in the sound of this coral moving in the water. So there's all of these little stories, but when you come to kind of composite the materials together, they take on another timeline, which is reflective of many years in some cases. This piece, almost like 15 years worth of recordings, are kind of sort of woven together into this rendering. So I think it's an interesting thing just in terms of language again and time. When not all voices speak, like we assume that voices speak in our time. And I think that's one of the challenges for us. Like, and what I love about talking to uh, people that are working with astronomy or other kinds of time-based studies that are so far in excess of the human body that they have to remind themselves all the time that the kind of conversations that we can have, the kinds of reception that we can make ourselves available to, sometimes are so infinitesimally small. We have to try and figure out what we can accumulate out of these tiny little moments that we get to be on, in this place, in this time. And I think it's interesting with that Oseni piece, thinking about the idea of this voice that is geographically disparate and temporally disparate, and that there is still some sense of communication there that's maintained in some respects in time, but also outside of time. And I think that is for me, is always one of the pleasures of working with sound because of the nature of what it is, that sort of immaterial relation that we have to it, that when we return to it, it does, I mean, partly it triggers things like memory in certain cases, but it also, um, because of the way that something like acousmatic listening, listening without its source, um, because of the relation that strikes up, it opens it kind of invites us to lean into that sound and lean into the possibility of it, which I think probably is also what I imagine in some respects is the one of the drivers for your work, Nether, is like you're inviting people to share your eyes, your fascination with something, whether it be like a microscopic perspective on something or whether it be something much more macro that you're just positioning and framing so people can share your fascination with it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think of it as I am struck with uh, things that are not rational, feelings that are not rational, ideas that are half formed. And they're typically what I'm trying to convey, but I can't because they dissipate very quickly when you try to pin them down and they turn into what they turn away from what you felt. And so um, I think by trying to convey the process, the feelings of the process, that's where I'm trying to pull people into experience not exactly what I felt, but to be open to that kind of half-formed possibility that's not predetermined and pre-closed um, and predefined.
Okay.
I have to say that both of your creative processes, as I can hear, this is my opinion, they have ritualistic qualities in the sense of what you're doing is not very specifically creating a space where the result is not important. It's actually the experience of in this case, drawing a tree and what you can feel and not rationally learn from that experience, and what you get from that experience is actually what makes the whole process or the whole thing valuable for you. Like a ritual where you go and, for example, I identify a lot with that. I do photography and I don't take a lot of photos, but each photo that I take nowadays is a ritual for me because this is how I see that practice. So I can identify with that because it's kind of letting go of the process. And what you were saying earlier, Lawrence, as well, the medium has its own agency. It's also recognizing that the kind of let go of control that there is, even though the camera has like this all measured and everything, you know, and even the sound recorder has their own like technology. Is never like 90 and 100% accurate. There's always a 0.1% that it could actually do something that nobody's expecting, not even the manufacturer. So I think these two ideas are really that idea of the ritualistic quality of your creative process is really beautiful because it also points toward uh, kind of a search, an inner search of connecting with the outer world through your creative processes. And I want to go to the next question. But there is an idea on both stories um, that human beings must make peace with the fact that from a rational perspective we cannot not understand everything. That's something that we have already mentioned in this conversation. And I want to know where do you think letting go of this rational need to explain everything could lead us?
Look, I think it's a really interesting provocation to think about because I think generally, excuse me, at least for all of my life, I've not known any other, uh, political economic structure than neoliberalism. And
Mm.
what neoliberalism tends to prioritize or privilege is the idea of quantification. And I mean, in very practical terms, it's the capacity to make things have an economic value that means that they're somehow useful and meaningful in a kind of economic context, which is the sort of predominant way that we kind of negotiate contemporary politics and business and basically everyday life. I think this drive towards quantification is a really interesting situation because I think it's very um, easy because it's reproducible. And what I mean by that is that you can use certain whatever equations, ways of approaching materials to kind of show a discrete amount or function or output or however you want to describe it. And I think when you look at contemporary education, the kind of pressure towards things like STEM, and this is in no disrespect, this is not like a case of being against STEM, because I think that's all knowledge is really valuable. But the kinds of methodologies that have been promoted and reinforced in the last nearly 50 years now um, tend to uh, either shun or move away from the kinds of uh, knowledge development ways and methodologies that we have historically used as a species. And I mean by that like qualitative data. Um, I think the kind of the dismantling of the humanities is a really telling um, a, a telling sign, I would say, about how we've like where we've arrived. And I think what that d does is that it reduces our capacity to really interrogate ourselves, partly because it's a way of denying certain kinds of questions or making them seem less relevant or less valuable. And in doing that, what we do is we shrink things, we shrink the world to that which is apparently able to be known. And I think knowledge and fact and truth are really important, but I also think that aspiration and curiosity and desire for new ideas and desire for um, considering reconsidering the positions that we assume are kind of a priori situation. I think we have to constantly push against that because it is really easy, particularly when we've had generations under one particular way of being, that people just assume that's how it is. Like the fact that we think of housing as an asset class, and this is a problem in our country, I know it is in North America too, that it's an asset class and not a human right, that doesn't have to be that way. You know, the kind of value structures that we attach to certain kinds of things, the kind of aspiration for capital advancement of individualism, the kind of Thatcherite Reaganism that still today's kind of echoed. These are things we can choose to reject. It's just about whether we have uh, partly whether we give ourselves permission to do that, and then also whether we can work towards opening up the possibilities for that at a macro level, whether that be community, whether that be in kind of the political zeitgeist, whatever the case might be. We need to basically make space for other ways because there's not one best way. In the same way that every single body is different. You know, we need to celebrate that difference. The idea of reducing bodies down to kind of quantifiable factors, which I mean, I understand it from a medical perspective, let's say, that you have to find a baseline for how much ibuprofen you put into a tablet. Okay, I get that. But to assume that every single body is going to react to that the same way is naive and it's lazy, actually. And it's sometimes it's easy to be lazy. And I would say we are very good at finding ease and very good at finding comfort. And I don't feel, I mean, I think everyone should obviously aspire to that, but actually some discomfort is really important. You know, some challenge is really important because if we're going to grow, if we're going to develop a sense of well-being, then you know, Dolly Parton had it right. You can only know the sunshine if you know the rain. And, you know, she's an incredibly smart woman. simple punchlines that are just, they cut through everything. You know, when that woman is gone, we are going to be lesser on this planet. There is no question.
Well, first of all, I think that when they're renaming the airport in Nashville, that they should call it Parton instead of whatever right-wing person they're going to call it for. But that's beside the point.
Amen. Amen.
But so what you were saying there is pretty on the nose for me, for two reasons. One is the quantifiers are dismantling my government, like literally rewriting the code for the Treasury Department right now. I mean, like now. If I was in DC, I'd be down there in front of the building. But also to reveal my career history, I'm a librarian. And one of the things from the point of view of knowledge systems, one of the things that has always frustrated me that has become, I'd say, over my lifetime, more and more and more, um, the siloing of knowledge bases, um, where even art and art history don't communicate, or uh, and that not only do they not communicate, but you literally cannot communicate across disciplines without punishment. Um, and that's a little far from sitting with a tree, but it's also related, I think, in the sense that uh, we need to bring things back together, to bring things back to wholeness. And the body is a way to do that with this type of very small work that I was doing. And then it creates spaces for new ways of connecting different insights. Like I can get an insight through, in this case, it was a literal dream where I was thinking about the trees being really old and uncomfortable and on the edge of the world, and like discarded people. And it was a literal dream, and it was a way of looking at it that was very much not determined by what we call our mainstream knowledge systems. I don't know if that's kind of lost track of the question a little bit. So.
No, I think it's really, really on point, because what Lawrence was mentioning is like the system that kind of closes the options, the possibilities for us, in a sense that is related to what you were saying, that how the science are actually also fractured in a way that they don't communicate to each other. It's starting to, now universities, they are starting all these plans of like how geography is talking to sociology and anthropology, at least here in Costa Rica, is kind of still really, really like secluded in between. Now they're starting to talk, but somehow the knowledge is also like fractured, and this is what you're mentioning, the scientific knowledge is fractured, and also the science is fractured from all the knowledge that comes from our bodies, from our myths, from a lot of things that we don't consider valuable source of knowledge in that, like, quote unquote. The I think this is a really interesting conversation. We appreciate it. I'm going to jump to the last question so we can open up the questions from Alessandra and Carolina, and also between you guys. And the last question is more related to like to your own like personal experiences. Both the stories recognize the modern human world's agency and their ability to communicate with their own languages. What do you think it is relevant to recognize these voices in our daily lives today? And how has it influenced your own lives?
I just on the face of it, hearing a story from two different points of view is, you always learn something different. The story's not the same. So, I think that's just where I start is sort of that's a valuable practice is to have as many points of view um, informing you, and it can be just and sometimes it's just a simple shift, like your friend is annoying. Well, try to be charitable about why they're being annoying, and then you can be not annoyed. I mean, that's a silly small example, but it's you can find a lot of solace, and then you can find a lot of new ways of solving problems. Um, and I find a lot of excitement out of new ways of connecting things. And I also find comfort and solace um, in the space that that process allows. Um, Sometimes I get frustrated because it's like not solving anything, and I think I might be in one of those places right now. But that's but that sort of is part of the process. You kind of go through the dystopia and crawl out the other side. We hope.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting uh, thing to contemplate because I mean, fundamentally, I think the value in a lot of this, uh, like work and in the practices that we develop in our lives, and I mean this for everyone, even the people that are just curious about uh, the places that they find themselves in, people that are travelers and not tourists. You know, I think there is a really simple satisfaction in being available to the world. And I think when I say it's a simple satisfaction, it's something that in some respects takes no effort to just be somewhere and to be available to the way that the light looks on the trees or the sound of the traffic lights as you cross the road, you know, the kind of traffic signal, like in different parts of the world, those sound different. Um, I think all of these really little, inconsequential, incidental, in some cases insignificant moments allow us to be present. And I think we're very good at filtering out and we're very good at not being present because in some cases, I mean, going back to this question of qualification and quantification, yeah, and actually delivery means that we're generally, particularly as, I mean, I'm a freelance worker. So I'm constantly thinking of the next thing because I need to like feed my family next week. And so the idea of kind of being in the moment is actually a kind of luxury. And I think increasingly for most people, it is a luxury. But it's a luxury that we should afford ourselves because it costs nothing except time. And there was a great line from John Zorn that basically said, you know, don't trade time for money. And I mean, okay, so there's some kind of very big economic questions in that statement, but aspirationally, I think that's a really interesting thing to kind of hold close sometimes because it is very easy to trade your life away and and it's not some holistic, you know, at the crossroads selling your soul kind of situation. It's the little things every second to second that you let go of. And the world is very good at taking those seconds because of the nature of the things that we've set up for ourselves, the kind of beautiful traps that we've made for ourselves. So uh, to be curious, to allow yourself that um, space, maybe, and recognition of place and time is fundamental, I think, to being being satisfied, not necessarily being happy or sad or I mean there's maybe contentment there, but like being satisfied with the way that you negotiate um the world and the people around you. You know, to it, like you say, your annoying friends, sometimes you just got to be available to them and be generous. You know, these very simple things that make the world better and they're better because of us. that we're offering something in excess of our own gain, our own, uh, predatory kind of instincts, something that is more than us.
Finally, so beautiful. I think like you are pointing to something that is really crazy to say, but it's actually almost like the attention and the contemplation on those little things that will connect us back to the present and to the land is actually like an act of resistance nowadays, right? Like it's really crazy to like have the, like you said, it's a privilege for some people to actually have that time to contemplate and to, but it's something that is available for everybody. If we kind of if people are conscious about that, they can actually do the time and start putting more attention where they are distracting, or when they are like actually putting their attention on something that is totally like nonsense. So I want to open now the space to for you to, either Nethery or Lawrence, you can start asking a questions to one another, or if Carolina or Alessandra have a question or opinion they want to share, they can do so right now.
I do have a question, and well, first of all, thank you. This has been such a lovely conversation to listen. Um, so there was this conversation about agency, about how our mediums have agency, and we've been also speaking about how your stories recognize the agency of the more than human world. And I recently read this phrase speaking about art that said something like, "What you make also makes you." And then I just started sort of like speculating, that there could also be this idea that we think that we go out into the world as humans and make art, let's say, about nature or with nature, or with other beings. And um, I was just sort of entertaining the idea of that maybe it is the tree that wants to make art through you, and maybe it is the ocean that also wants to make art, and then you become sort of like this channel, for the world to speak and to manifest their presence as well. Um, I was just wondering, is art a way the world makes us? And if it is, like how does your art or your subjects make you? Like, what has been your experience of, you know, how does the Pacific Ocean makes you, Lawrence, and how do the trees make you, Nethery? I'm curious to know what work of art these subjects are um, executing on you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a very interesting question because historically, when we think about field recording and like, recording environments, the way that we originally thought about them in the early part of the 20th century is the same way that we thought about photography. In fact, early field recordings were sometimes called sound photographs because at that point, photography was seen as the objective capture of the world in the same way that early field recordings, because of this sort of pretext of ethnography, and at that point, a kind of colonial ethnography that was very much about something is right and something is not right. Um, there was this sort of kind of idea that you were objectively capturing the world. I mean, thankfully, we moved away from that in the late 60s. There's a piece that I often talk about by a French composer, Luc Ferrari, called Presque Rien, which means almost nothing. And the kind of line is that he did almost nothing to the recordings, literally just edited them together. It's this wonderful recording of a fishing village in Korčula on what is now the Croatian coast. Excuse me. So it's interesting for me because I think, my work or any of the work of anyone working with sound is the material content is the world, but if you like, the question for me that has really loomed quite large in the last sort of decade and a half has been like, well, if it is about this subjective kind of approach to these, materials that are kind of constantly unfolding, where is it that if you like, the creativity falls in art making, in the practice. And for me, my argument is, and I'm always up for having a conversation about it, my argument is that it's actually in the listenership, that your capacities are the things that guide. And then, like we were saying before, this idea of the translation device, the microphone becomes the opportunity to share those preoccupations and interests. So it is, I think, in some respects, the world as a kind of subject material, does make you, because or at least it contours you, because you have to be available to it, and available to what I guess in some respects what you could say is the chaotic flux of the world. You can't control it. And I think within that function, there's a kind of giving over, but at the same time, there's a kind of commitment to that dynamism. You have to actually be present, because if you're not listening in that moment, then that thing's gone. It's not coming. It's not going to happen again. It's like, I don't know, fishing. If you don't have your line in the ocean, you're not going to catch a fish. So you have to kind of be there. And those choices that we make about being there or not are kind of fundamental, and they become the determinants for how we are, and in fact how the work becomes at the same time.
I think in terms of what it's changed for me is that I've started to see, and it sounds a little strange, I start to see people more when I look at trees. Yeah, I'm starting a new project, and I don't know how much actual art I'll be doing. I think I may be more of a curator for a piece of land, and the people who are stewarding it currently, and then it'll be looking at the stewardship of that land and the plants, obviously. It's a farm, it's an urban farm. And I find it a little surprising that drawing and painting, and looking at trees to find out, what color is that leaf, has led me to this place, which is really a very social place.
If you want to support our project, you can share this episode, visit our digital magazine wimblu.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Patreon community, where you can access exclusive content starting at $3 a month. Your support allows us to create and share content that reimagines a fair and healthy world for all life forms.